of scholarly import. At the same time, it seems to have it has a tremendous resonance around the left, and the use of, the two modern forms that he considers the revolutionary instruments, obviously film and photography, for left purposes and for radical revolutionary purposes. So he does have a real sense of the future. He doesn't really bemoan or has any nostalgia for this lost aura, in my opinion. I think he looks at the aura in a complex way, and maybe that's a good starting point tonight. The section 3 that we finished with last time. Beth, welcome, and we're in section 3 and 4 of the work of art in the age of technical reproduction, and I'm using technical because of the German word is much closer to technical than it is mechanical. It is not mechanical. It's a very bad translation, and I think the new translations have taken that into account, but we're using the Harry Zahn translation from Hannah Arendt's introduction to illuminations. Yeah, the second to last essay. And anyway, I maybe should begin here with to read again section 3. I think Matt, you want me to? Okay, I guess these people are trying to get in, Christine and Jocelyn. Okay. Going back to section 3 of the essay, and I like the way he frames this numerically, Roman numerals, each one contains a very interesting nugget and kind of comes full circle. So this again was the attempt to go beyond Alois, Rigaud, and Vikhoff, who were two dominant Viennese school art historians at the time. And just to reread what we did last week to kind of set the stage for today, the scholars of the Viennese school, and this is on page 222 in the Arendt edition, and section 3, about 9 lines down. The new kind of perception he's looking at, the mode of human sense perception changes with humanity's mode of existence. So the historical notion of perception in many ways, and the social as well, that Benjamin emphasizes, etc., who resisted the weight of classical tradition under which these later art forms had been buried, were the first to draw conclusions for them concerning the organization of perception at that time. So they were able to see this. I guess you could say the same of Erwin Panofsky and others, a little later as art historians, even Greenberg to a degree, although I think Greenberg takes into account more the notion of Benjamin's history and natural aura here, the historical and the natural that he goes through later. So anyway, however far reaching their insight, these scholars limited themselves in showing the significant formal hallmark which characterized perception in late Roman times. They did not attempt, and perhaps saw no way, to show the social transformations. And of course, this is going to be crucial to his argument. He isn't an argument against Riegel and other traditional art historians that are very dominant in Germany during that time, that were expressed by these changes of perception. The conditions for an analogous insight are more favorable in the present, and if changes in the medium of contemporary perception can be comprehended as a decay of the aura, it is possible to show its social causes. So, very important, the concept of aura, which was proposed above with reference to historical objects, may usefully be illustrated to the reference to the aura of natural ones. And we define the aura of the natural ones as the unique phenomena, and this becomes very important for him throughout the essay, the unique phenomena of a distance, however close it may be. 1. While resting on a summer afternoon, you follow with your eyes a mountain range on the horizon or a branch which casts its shadow over you. You experience the aura of those mountains and of that branch. This image makes it easy to comprehend the social basis of the contemporary decay of the aura. It rests on two circumstances. both of which are related to the increasing significance of the masses in contemporary life, namely the desire of contemporary masses to bring things closer spatially. And this also plays out very much later too, and this closeness that is demanded, constantly, that painting does not afford as more of a contemplative art, whereas film brings this almost immediacy between audience and the screen, right? And this is very, very interesting the way he works this through later in the essay. And then, which is just as ardent as they're bent towards overcoming the uniqueness of every reality by accepting its reproduction. Every day, the urge grows stronger to get hold of an object at very close range by way of its likeness, its reproduction, right? Very interesting again. It's mimetic fallacy. Unmistakably, reproduction is offered by picture magazines, and this is interesting too, mass publication, mass marketed stuff, and newsreels differs from the image seen by the unarmed eye. Uniqueness and permanence are as closely linked to the latter as are transitoriness and reproducibility in the former. To pry an object from its shell, to destroy its aura, is the mark of a perception whose sense of the universal equality of things has increased to such a degree that it extracts it even from a unique object by means of reproduction. Thus, is manifested in the field of perception what in the theoretical sphere is noticeable in the increasing importance of statistics. And this is interesting too, how we get the top 10, the top 100, the hit parade, right? All of these things, right? Ranking systems, et cetera, et cetera. The adjustment of reality, and I think this is a crucial sentence for our purposes here about what is the masses' role in art and what is, the role of art vis-a-vis the masses. The adjustment of reality to the masses and of the masses to reality is a process of unlimited scope, as much as thinking as for perception. So this is really a very crucial, I think, switch in his essay that he's now going to be speaking about decline of aura, what the work of art now has as a function, right? How it can be pried from the fabric of tradition, right? And how it produces its functionality. I mean, I'd like to hear from you. Any thoughts about this so far? I mean, this whole notion of distance and nearness that Heidegger plays on too later, but in Heidegger's case, it's much more of the metaphysical and the signs and the wood paths. But in Benjamin, this has to do with the technical reproduction that the work of art is giving us now in this new function. So I think this is very, very important, and the use of the picture magazines, right, and of course the newsreels, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts?
I thought it was just interesting, a lot of this, that one, just the openness he's expressing towards these things, and the democratization that seems to be implied in this. At least that's how I read this sense of the universal equality of things, that he's not saying that that's a problem, that he's saying that, that's how I read it, that removing the aura, destroying the aura, is actually opening up the possibility of a more democratic approach to the work, to what we call artistic production. I'm wondering if other people.
Democratic approach in terms of perception being equalized, or what is
Well,
what do
I
you mean by
think
that
like
part?
later on, he talks about like everyone, writing is now based on sort of this polytechnic capacity rather than being an area specialist, and that everyone becomes a writer, right? And that, so there's this idea of sort of, the expert, and he talks about also as the masses in receiving the image, right, become sort of both the consumers but also the critic. Like these two things begin to be fused. It's a little, to me, it was a little confusing sometimes. It's not always clear, but yeah, I think he's talking about, the possibility of a kind of democratization in terms of both access and the need of a work of art to, in some sense, respond to a broader public. I mean,
Okay. Beryl, did you want to say something?
Yeah,
Please.
I'm
Yeah, please.
I think that is what he's saying, and it's that idea that why would you be nostalgic for art produced by a social structure that you want to overturn?
Right.
And I'm just, what's triggered in me is memories of the 80s and 90s, where a lot of media studies people
Mhm.
used Benjamin as a kind of means of valorizing some really appalling popular culture. And what they actually didn't take account of was the fact that this was not democratically produced. It was produced by an industry. It was produced by people from a different class
Right.
in order to sell commodities.
Right.
And I mean, I think there's this tension in the reception of Benjamin.
Yeah.
There's what he was arguing, and then there's the way what he was arguing has been taken up subsequently.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and there was a real struggle over that.
Absolutely.
Ultimately, how does art retain subversive value? And if you flatten it only to becoming statement and commodified as such, does it lose its value as a subversive practice? No matter how good it is. And we see the use of Russian formalism in Madison Avenue advertising all over the place. You can study the commercials that way. Yeah, Patrick, you're unmuted too.
I think Beryl's onto something. There's an ambivalence. Well, not Benjamin at this point in time is articulating both the democratic component. I think that definitely exists, but he also comes in, like with the last line, the way in which the masses adjust themselves to the media and the media adjusts themselves to the masses. There is this ambivalence, and I think later on, the tension with Horkheimer and Adorno comes around this whole issue, comes out in the dialectic of enlightenment, and where in the culture industry, I think in some ways, I was kind of looking at that today.
Yeah,
you can see that is that they're in dialogue with Benjamin. They take it in an entirely different direction, much more of a foreclosed situation. But
But he
very good. Yeah, please.
There's a part where this just jogged my memory, where he actually directly addresses exactly this theme, where he talks about how it's further on, but he talks about, representation, people's genuine desire, valid desire for, direct representation. And then he talks about how those possibility, this is on.
You see, this becomes a real, what page? I'm sorry.
This is section 10. I have this version, section 10, the top of 184. And there's this, he talks about, particularly in Russia, this changeover has partially become established realities. Some of the players who we meet in Russian films are not actors in our sense, but people who portray themselves, and primarily in their own work processes. In Western Europe, the capitalistic exploitation of the film denies consideration of modern man's legitimate claim to being reproduced. Under these circumstances, the film industry is trying hard to spur the interest of the masses through illusion-promoting spectacles and dubious speculation. So he's not ambiguous. I mean, that is actually a place where.
But I want to just. Yeah. I just want to return to what Patrick brought up, this last sentence. The adjustment of reality to the masses and of the masses to reality is a process of unlimited scope, so much for thinking as for perception. He ends this essay, we were supposed to have completed it with Marinetti and Futurism, right, in a sense, which had the way of speaking very differently to the masses than, say, Ziga Vertov's, Man with a Movie Camera, or Sergei Eisenstein's Odessa Steps in terms of montage. So in many ways, so there is something to be said for the really paradoxical and at times contradictory nature of what Benjamin is doing here. So I don't want us just to say he's for complete, the masses in art, and art is done for the masses. I don't think that's really his intention. I think he's trying to look at certain schools and illustrate through the Vertov group, Eisenstein. I like what Douglas wrote about Abel Gance, who was considered a giant. Marty Scorsese swears by Abel Gance, in terms of epic cinema, the Napoleon series, and Jacques, is of course another great film of Gance's, the use of Zola, and many people said he's excellent in social realism. But
I wanted to just jump in for a second, because not because I have clarity, but because I want to raise maybe a point.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I think that there is a kind of ex cathedra kind of proclamatory power of Benjamin's rhetoric here that almost feels, especially in the theses as well, as being kind of so authoritative that we don't challenge it. There's almost something that when you first read it, you don't dig into it. It feels extremely powerful, and it almost feels beyond question. And yet, one of the things I find personally like more of an experiential feeling, and I also see aspects of this later on in the way Baudrillard in Simulacra and Simulation is playing around with some of these same themes of the authentic. But what I wanted to say is that when I read this, I actually feel like the presentation of the masses that Benjamin sees is actually quite opposite to my own experience. Like for me, there's nothing so, we were talking about earlier with jazz, we may have heard a recording hundreds of times, but there's something about seeing something live that gives it that kind of that is a kind of aura, because there is a kind of immediacy, but it's also a kind of a non-reproducible type of substance, this intangible, ineffable kind of feeling when you're in the moment. So for example, if we are watching your recording of this seminar 2 hours later, 3 hours later, something's lost in that. There's something about being in a live setting, something that seems unreproducible, that is an immanence that I feel, and it's that with the reproduction, it almost feels like that becomes almost more valuable to the extent that the reproduction becomes so dominant.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, good point. I mean, again, who's going to capture the masses is sort of what Benjamin's political intention is here in so many ways. And he understands, obviously, the battle of the futurists and what's going on.
Yeah.
He understands this. It's just like who captures in the United States, right? In a sense right now, politically, where's this going on? What kind of images are being used to capture certain, types of things? So he's warning against that. I think the most important thing here is to really look at this transition from ritual and cult to exhibition value. This really becomes important. And I was going to bring up, I was waiting for Josh, because the new thing in the art market, of course, is the non-fungible tokens, the NFTs, right? So you probably know about this guy, what was his name? Loic Guzer, who sold the Da Vinci for Sotheby's, and then went out on his own, and he has an IPO called Particle, where he sells parts of famous paintings, right? So you too, for $1,500, have the status of being able to own a Basquiat or something else. So this is a new thing that is really going on about reproducibility, ownership, etc. And maybe we should try to extend this in a certain level, beyond Vance Packard and Mills and others, in terms of what is status value? What does that really mean beyond that of exhibition value? And why do people want ownership in this so much? And what does this have to do with mass reproduction and reproducibility, and how much is really actually lost at this point to this new Yes,
just
please.
one more. I mean, and we are maybe going beyond the programmatic nature of the text. I mean, this is a programmatic text in some respects.
Yeah.
But one thing I do think there's an interesting comparison if we're talking about it phenomenologically, which is what I was kind of doing, which is the way Benjamin describes so poetically the way in which the soldier comes back in that very famous passage, comes back, he's on the battlefield and he's been reduced. So there's this idea that Agamben takes later on with his idea of experience, that experience has been hollowed out and experience has been, so the masses, in a way, this is a positive look at what can happen with the new technologies. But at the same time, there's the other side of the coin, which is that the individual experience of the in the modern world has been in some ways vacuumed out somehow. And I think we could see that as maybe a more darker reading of some of the later Benjamin in that respect.
You know,
Yeah, I agree with you. I just want to mention, section 3 is very important to keep in mind about voice, and this is section 3 of the thesis on the philosophy of history. Sorry to go a bit outside the text, but I think it's important for us. This is on the chronicler, those who write, who recites events without distinguishing between major and minor ones, acts in accordance with the following truth. Nothing that has ever happened should be regarded as lost for history. And this is where Benjamin is definitely coming from. To be sure, only a redeemed mankind receives the fullness of its past, which is to say, only for a redeemed mankind has its past become citable in all of its moments. Each moment it has lived becomes a citation à l'ordre du jour, and that day is Judgment Day. And this is Benjamin really, speaking about we have hope for those who do not have hope. That's his definition of hope. This is where he's always motivated by this in terms of his own personal, right? Yeah. Desire here, if you will. This is very important to keep in mind. So the masses, as we just understand the masses, there's a different layer here as well that's really going on, right? When this is the mass, in a sense. You would never get this saying out of Theodore Adorno. We must have hope for those without hope. You would never get that out of Theodore Adorno.
Or Kafka. Or Kafka.
I'm not trying to be empty or Agamben for that matter, right?
Yeah, anyway.
Well, it's interesting, what Douglas raised, it's interesting because, this idea of, well, a couple of things. I wanted to ask Patrick if he read this last sentence in section 3 as a critique per se, or an expression of, pessimism. I don't think it necessarily, I think we might read it that way now, but I don't think
no,
credited that.
No, I don't think it was pessimistic.
More open, active.
I think it was, I would say, ambivalent. I mean, it can go in either direction.
Yeah.
Actually, I think of this in terms of, there's that expression in Marx's early writing about when theory grips the masses, which he's grappling with the same issue. And there is this, but there's this openness to it, but there's also that it can go in other directions. And they pointed out in section 10, he does talk about the pessimistic possibilities. And, but no, it's, I think in general, the whole essay is very open in terms of the democratic component.
The other thing I just wanted to, say is when Douglas was talking, about sort of this emptying out of the subject, or this flattening of, subjectivity, I was just looking at some of the Frankfurt School, and I was reading Society of the Spectacle also, and that's a very common theme that appeared in a lot of this work. And I guess I've always been a little skeptical of that. Like, how do we actually arrive at that determination that, the subjectivity of the contemporary masses is impoverished, as opposed to, the slave traders in Dutch society? I mean, it's interesting, and I don't know if we'll be coming back to that. But one thing, is that's not present. He's actually trying to embrace something that I think is very open, and he has.
He's looking at form and social transformation side by side. This is his dialectic always, and in some senses, I mean, you have to remember, lyric poet in High Capitalism of Baudelaire is an example of this kind of approach, right? In a sense, Baudelaire is not speaking on behalf of the masses, but he speaks to the decadence, right, of the period. It becomes part of the decadent poets in a way. Just like Dadaism wasn't out there just on behalf of, he has a long section on the word salvo and Dadaism. And the same thing in music, as we all know, we can think of Mozart as a people's artist, and we can hear certain things in classical music, but at the same time, we're still not, he's really trying to defend. You have to remember, this is a period in history where they're all trying to, everybody that's involved on the left is trying to develop an aesthetic for proletarian art, if you will, or for, this uprising, the ascendant class in a way. So I don't, and in some ways, the Adornos, the world, take this the furthest in terms of saying we cannot get to the subject unless we go fully to the extreme dialectical position of, absolute pessimism, ultimately, right? And, and this is only when the subject really reemerges is when that dialectic is pushed to the extreme. So to me, the issue here is more about reproducibility and reduplications of image, or in other words, what else is new, right? What is new at this point? That Brechtian drama in some ways still reproduces the system, right? In some ways, for all of its subversion and objectification, distantiation that's taking place. And one of the reasons it's good to look at this as distance and closeness, etc. The Brechtian moment still reduplicates something in the capitalist system, right?
Yeah.
It's
Can I just interject one quick one? Maybe one more point of connection that helps me is between the idea of the aura and the Benjamin idea of the profane illumination. Because if we're talking about this experience as well, and we see that in the essay on hashish, and I don't mean to jump forward into other essays, but we see this idea that the experience of hashish is profoundly religious, potentially. It's a religious euphoric experience, but the person ingesting the hashish understands that this is not a religious experience or epiphany. This is actually induced by the drugs. Well, the same thing with the reproducibility. The person in the cinema knows in their head that this same movie will be aired multiple times by the end of the week, and this is just another repetition of the same thing, but they experience it in a way as a profane illumination. So maybe that's another option to think about.
Right. Well, I think, again, we raise these issues. Another tension seems to be working between authenticity and inauthenticity.
Right.
Quote, art object. What really makes something? Is today the forgery greater than the original in some way?
Right.
Which is something Wim Wenders, as I mentioned last week, raises in The American Friend, through the person of Nicholas Ray, who's the artist who's in Soho, right, who is reproducing, major artworks, and it cannot be the difference cannot be detected. In fact, may even be better, right?
It gets into that as well. I agree. Yeah.
Exactly. So this again is a real question too. How do you is art, in terms of its function, revolutionary function, is to subvert dominant consciousness? Is that a working definition of art for the left, right? Or is it just mere statement? Does art just become political statement? And this to me is a very, very good question in a way, that social realism in a sense did not really subvert. It actually gave statement. It gave, models, values to, analyzing, the social realist schools, but did it really subvert anything? Was that question of irony, the sublime, all these categories that, really a great artist can work with, and, you can really start working with. I know there are books about this. I'm not expert enough to determine if this is true or not, but Shostakovich, for example, Dmitri Shostakovich, in the relationship to the Stalinists and Zondoism in the arts. How much is he subverting in that music that he's allowed to continue to create?
Yeah.
Right?
I know that this is more speculative on my part, and this is probably one of Benjamin's most famous, if not famous, essays. But part of me, having read so much other Benjamin's work, feels like this represents a kind of programmatic effort, but it's very different from Benjamin's own affinities as a collector, as a person. It seems to go very much, and it really speaks to Benjamin's ability to find these contrarieties in his own self and his dialectical kind of approach. But as if the affinities, the elective affinities seem very different than the kind of Benjamin that I think his inclinations would lead us to. That's just a personal.
Yeah, to me, this is a conversation with Brecht and Azarlakis.
Yes,
right, more
so.
with Adorno, even though Adorno read over the manuscript and critiqued it, it could be part of that too. It's not so much within the Benjamin of the German tragic drama or the Benjamin of the earlier essays, the image of Proust, etc. These kind of things. I think it's much more closer to conversations with Brecht, right, as well as his relationship to the Soviet actress and militant that he
I think so.
Moscow. And remember, yes, Moscow Diary is about 8 years, 7-8 years before this, and he took him to that. And I think I'd mentioned in 1926 he had thought that the Soviet Union had taken the wrong turn, so to speak. Right? He was very much to 24, 25, but by 26, it's kind of seen a wrong turn, right, in many ways. But again, you have many players here. If you know the history of some of these productions, I mean, the use of Abel Gance, right, of course, the use of Chaplin, and then, of course, we have also the use of Dadaism, and maybe that's a good point, really a very interesting thing to look at, too, how he deals with Dadaism, which was, quote, the cutting edge, if you will, and, I know Zizek, what would have happened if Tristan Tzara had met Lenin at the coffee shop back in the day, right? A nice imaginative journey there. Which is good. So let me just turn to that just for a second, and then we can go back. This is, we're going to read it somewhat backwards. I hope this is section 14. One of the foremost tasks, and we're getting to tasks here. We can go back to exhibition and cult value and aura and non-auratic in a few minutes. But anyway, let's look at the task. One of the foremost tasks of art has always been the creation of a demand, which could only be fully satisfied later, only later. The history of every art form shows critical epochs in which a certain art form aspires to effects, which could be fully attained only with a changed technical standard, that is to say, in a new art form. The extravagances and crudities of art, which thus appear, particularly in the so-called decadent epochs, and he puts so-called, right, in a way, this is interesting. Baudelaire, who was a man of the streets, as was not a quote, it was lumpen in some ways, Baudelaire. Marx would not have really liked Baudelaire. Sartre, actually, in his Marxist phase, wrote a very nasty psychoanalytic appraisal of Baudelaire. Yeah, and it's interesting, in terms of that militancy that went on. Anyway, it said, actually arise from the nucleus, and this is interesting too, of its richest historical energies. In recent years, such barbarisms were abundant in Dadaism. It is only now that its impulse becomes discernible. So when it emerges, in a sense, right, we don't really find the creation of a demand until it gets satisfied later. It is only now that its impulse becomes discernible. Dadaism attempted to create by pictorial and literary means the effects which the public today seeks in the film. Very interesting. This is kind of precondition for cinema and the appetite that is created, the appetite and the viscerality that is created. Every fundamentally new pioneering creation of demands will carry beyond its goal. Dadaism did so to the extent that it sacrificed the market values, which are so characteristics of the film, in favor of higher ambitions, though of course it was not conscious of such intentions as here described. The Dadaists attach much less importance to the sales value of their work than to its usefulness for contemplative immersion. The studied degradation of their material was not the least of their means to achieve this uselessness. Their poems are word salad, containing obscenities and every imaginable waste product of language. The same is true of their paintings, to which they mounted buttons and tickets. What they intended and achieved was a relentless destruction of the aura of their creations. Very interesting that the Dadaists really became the first to be able to both create and destroy in the same moment, right? In a way to disallow any possibility of, recuperability by the system in some ways. This is, I think, where he's going, which they branded as reproduction with every means of production, right? Which is interesting. Before a painting of art or a poem by August Strom, it is impossible to take time for contemplation and evaluation as one would before a canvas of Derains or a poem by Rilke. In the decline of middle-class society, contemplation became a school for asocial behavior. It was countered by distraction as a variant of social conduct. Dadaistic activities actually assured a rather vehement distraction by making works of art the center of scandal. One requirement was foremost to outrage the public, right? In a way, the provocations. From an alluring appearance or persuasive structure of sound, the work of art of Dadaists became an instrument, and this is interesting too, of ballistics, right? Right? It hit the spectator like a bullet. It happened to him, thus acquiring a tactile quality. It promoted a demand for the film, the distracting element of which is also primarily tactile, being based on changes of place and focus which periodically assail the spectator. Let us compare the screen on which a film unfolds with the canvas of a painting. The painting invites the spectator to contemplation. Just go to the museum versus the cinema house. Before the movie frame, he cannot do so. No sooner has his eye grasped the scene than it is already changed. It cannot be arrested. Duhamel, who detests the film and knows nothing of its significance, though something of its structure, notes this circumstance as follows. I can no longer think what I want to think. My thoughts have been replaced by moving images, right? This is good. The spectator's process of association in view of these images is indeed interrupted by their constant sudden change. This constitutes the shock effect of the film, which, like all shocks, should be cushioned by a heightened presence of mind. By means of its technical structure, the film has taken the physical shock effect out of the wrappers in which Dadaism had, as it were, kept it inside the moral shock effect. Right? So this is interesting on the whole notion of being shocked, right? Which we no longer have the experience of. We think we've had experienced it all. We don't go through that shock value anymore, or the shock of something, or being, stunned, being struck. We don't use those verbs anymore. Those are verbs that are now we're numbed. We're numb to there is no alternative to the Tina syndrome, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean,
we have a very hard time getting outside of this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I mean, just to, what you said, now we're numbed. I mean, it's this quote that I also found really interesting. I can no longer think what I want to think. My thoughts have been replaced by moving images. The degree of direction, right, of consciousness, and the lack of, and then I wonder if Benjamin is when he talks about the shock value of the film, which, like all shocks, should be cushioned by heightened presence of mind. If he means, the ability to kind of critically reflect on the experience you're having as you watch the film, which I do find difficult myself. I mean, I just don't watch enough films, but there is a way, like, you can't stop. Well, now you can at home. You can stop it, but you kind of interrupt the flow of the film. And it's not easy to distance yourself in a sense.
Well, I mean, there are many experiments within this. So again, it raises the idea of what is film, what is its role, how does it work? I mean, no accident that Godard called the later 60s and early 70s the Ziga Vertov group, when he went with Jean-Pierre Caron, that you had the East German directors, Jean-Marie Straub and Daniel Coulier, who actually do very Brechtian things. Moses and Aaron are kind of going back to a very traditional story, but doing it in such a way through a very Marxist lens in terms of, territory, et cetera, spatiality, all of these things. So I think he's done, I'm always reminded, a book that sort of, when I was very young, kind of altered my perception, was reading Walker Percy's The Moviegoer, which and a really great novella, won the National Book Award, 1961, I think it was. And, being from New Orleans, of course, it had a different resonation for me because I knew a lot of characters like who he was drawing on in the book. And anyway, but film played a very important role in this, obviously the title, but in the book, Walker Percy basically talked about film as certification of reality, which is interesting vis-a-vis Benjamin, that film actually gives us a kind of certification of reality. And as you mentioned, Carl, repeating Benjamin's word, a heightened presence or a heightened awareness. Film gives us that. It also has a very magical quality to it as well, because he goes through this very beautiful analog, if you remember, between the magician and the painting, right? And the sculpture, the surgeon and the film, right? And the ability to film to really cut deeply, right, without being so close in some ways, and in many ways. So this is very, very important, I think, to really think this through, in a way. I agree with Douglas that it's programmatic in many ways. He's writing a programmatic piece here. He's trying to satisfy the demand for an aesthetic, moment in terms of art. I know that Adorno had only written on music during this time. He wrote later Transparencies on Film with Krakauer, as you know, and Heinz Eisler in particular, who was very well known in Hollywood, right, et cetera. And these people were also very good friends with, what's his name, who did, oh God, why am I blocking on his name? Lati Lenya's husband, his name, the guy that wrote Vile. Yeah, sorry, Kurt. Yeah, so all these characters, Adorno, as Patrick's reading the Dialectic of Enlightenment, and Horkheimer, they're in Pacific Palisades during this period, right? And they're really, really seeing this, and there was a lot of comrades from the back, that time. And another great a book to read in this context on these issues would be Dr. Falster and the consultant to that book. He and Mon had very many, conversations about this. And some people, in the book, Adrian
Leverkusen.
It was actually Theodore Adorno, and Adorno is the devil.
I've heard that Lukács also makes an appearance.
Yes, of course. And he makes an appearance in The Magic Mountain. Heidegger and Lukács, you want to really know the battle, read The Magic Mountain through those two, Settembretti and Nafta.
Well, those are both great books, and I have to say personally, I had a much easier time reading. I just wanted to bring up one more thing, which is I think definitely I'm trying to get the right bearings, and I know I'm kind of falling a little bit short of the mark, and I do feel like the focus on the masses is where Benjamin sees. There's another book by Horkheimer called Theory of Film, which also Hickory Krakauer's book Theory of Film, which is really good. But what I continue to see is this with the development of the masses in this text, I see a lot of parallels, not only to film, but also to the way he deploys the masses in his discussion of Baudelaire. Because this word shock, if I remember correctly, is also used is definitely taken from Baudelaire, and this idea of the shock of modern life and the city, the street, and so the masses are participating in film, this kind of mediated reality, in almost the same way you could argue that they participate in the viewing of the film as kind of passive objects engaged in this kind of constant kaleidoscopic type of shock. I'm also reminded finally of Virginia Woolf in Mrs. Dalloway with her representation of London, which is the similar idea of the spectacle of the bomber plane or the plane in the sky. So this is really what we're talking about as modernity, right? The technological reproduction of modernity.
Yeah, and Douglas, if footnote 19 in that section we just read talks exactly about this. You know, that I mean, it's a very interesting footnote.
Oh, the shock. Yeah.
Yeah, the film is the art form that is in keeping with the increased threat to his life which modern man has to face. Man's need to expose himself to shock effects is his adjustment to the dangers threatening him. The film corresponds to profound changes in the apperceptive apparatus, changes that are experienced on an individual scale by the man
Right.
in the street in big city traffic, on a historical scale by the present day citizen. To go back to, Michael, you said, like, today we don't say we're shocked, we say we're sort of numb. And it seems, like that's kind of where, that's interesting that's where kind of this has come to, that, like, what can you really do to shock the public anymore? Like, I don't know, stage a live execution?
Well, I mean, it's pretty clear that if you have, these new derivatives, like now you're going to have, not only the cryptocurrency, but now this has gone into the art market with the non-fungible tokens. And, what's next? What's really going on? Because we're living in this world according to data reproduction, data mining. Everything is being mined. And that's why we are so numb, because we no longer have that access to the unconscious. Listen, I remember, Beryl brought up the 80s. I remember when I was in Baltimore, I had a friend who was a psychoanalyst and said, all I'm getting is TV commercials coming up from the unconscious. So there's a long history, right? There's nothing about Dr. Faustus or, anyway. So, or the devil in the blue dress or whatever, none of these things even, So this has been going on a very, very long time.
Mike,
right?
one interesting example of the way that our experience of shock is kind of immediately incorporated or something like that into our, is incorporated back into everyday life and into the institutions from which it emerges, is to think about the representations of police violence and killings by police, which is part of what I study, right, in the last decade or so, and how quickly the emergence of videos, of visual evidence was taken up as like an obvious signal that things were really going to change this time, because now it can't be denied, and how quickly each video is just incorporated back into popular culture, right? Like often through like protests in mainstream sports, sometimes through commercials. Right. I studied like databases that emerged immediately after this or in the period after Michael Brown to track this stuff that have now gone defunct in the last few years, like since they emerged. So like the different forms of representation of police violence and police killings that like shock us so much that collectively, especially liberal consciousness figures, this is a new thing now. This is the end of what was. We're in a new realm. And within 24, 36 months, that just becomes part of the pattern of evidence that's just reincorporated into our understanding of how this whole thing works and what to expect in the future.
It just becomes a confirmation, right, in some sense of what we already know and almost what we've come to expect. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, and just the way that, yes, exactly that. And the speed with which it moves from shock back into the din of everyday life that right. Supposedly the shock, is a break from and disrupts.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And I mean, remember, he has this long, it came up last week, this long section on Atkins and his role, right, in terms of the crime scene and the daily metropolis and the use of the photograph, et cetera. And I think what David's talking to is something that dates back to this turn of the century, of the turn of the 20th century, and the photographic image, right, in a sense, and then how it's used in a sense in everyday life to keep people numbed and keep people under control. I mean, you always have to look at what, again, the idea of art as subversive is to get outside of control. It's to shock you into something else. It's to make you, really experience again. We went through this with Heidegger, and I think Benjamin is saying the same thing. The Erfahrung is being suppressed. It's all surface, and he uses this too. He speaks about psychoanalysis, and the psychopathology of everyday life. Another great sentence. And then I wanted to go to the last,
raise one point, Mike. I think that what the issue at stake, though, in some ways, is that can art really shock anymore? And I think that I would say not really. I mean, like even more recently, like in American jazz, when like Ornette or, people like that came out, like they provoked all this opposition. Now it's like, anything goes, whatever, it's like, whatever. I don't see it, I mean.
Well, I mean, I think you raise a good point too, that I've said this many times in my own way. What everybody's afraid of is polemics and opposition. The phrase in liberal circles and Politicize, we agree to disagree. And that's not the level of this, but the polemics, the really strong, and the violence of polemics, polemos is really a violent term in ancient Greek, right? And to really engage in that, you do not have those schools that develop anymore, or et cetera. It's reduced to political camps, who you hang with, or something like that. No longer really about the polemic of form, and ideas. It's more about, who do you associate with? Yeah. Who do you represent? And it comes back to this whole question of representation. The art is supposed to, critique representation if it's going to be subversive. This goes back to Heidegger, this long stuff we did in the Age of the World picture. Remember, it's a world picture. It's a picture thinking, the image once again. And the same thing, in terms of the question concerning technology, how we're enframed and ensnared in all of this all the time. And how do you fracture that and break that and get to something else? I mean, look, in the 80s, again, the 90s, keywords, paradigm shift, right? It's a paradigm shift, right? So we don't really even hear that anymore, right? We don't even hear anything. So we're really in this really mindless numbness, right? Of this digitalization of everyday life, and at the same time, this reproducibility that doesn't allow for any thought to creep in. And I don't know what the function of art, because again, remember that took place in the 20th century, Dadaism, Surrealism, even the abstract expressionists to their degree had tremendous despite their CIA involvement, we don't really know the level of that. Of course, those are theses out there. And of course, you can say, they became emissaries, again, and used in the Cold War, but that's like saying Louis Armstrong was the CIA agent, blowing the horn on you. The same kind of thing was leveled against him. So I think the real question here, again, you're right, Carl. I mean, are we so numbed? Are we so at this place, in this museum of culture, this museum of looking back, where like, the Angelus Novus, whose wings no longer can be thrust into the future. It's a great image. I mean, it's a great image. And how do we begin to chip away at the conundrum? How do you have what Marx would call, how do you build the poetry of the future? Marx never said, the new, that really is the claim, to my mind, of what leftism is about. How do you build a society that is based on a poetics of the future? Right? And that's always the task. And instead, it's just being run over, right? Constantly, where you're telling stories about Paul Robeson or Malcolm X or whatever. And then this gets in the hands of Hollywood, and then they make a movie, et cetera. Demolished, the way wear T-shirts with Che Guevara. You know how it's totally commodified. So this is why I think this essay, with all due, to Walter Benjamin, and maybe whatever traces we may have here of, all the ambiguities and the ambivalences that work out. I mean, this is really trying to raise these issues in a way, that we have all these technical means, but what are they being used for, and how are they being used for? And to me, it's the struggle.
But before you get off on that, I want to float an idea out there that
Sure.
I mean, obviously there's an influence of Brecht here in the notion of estrangement effect.
Yes.
But there's something else in the sense, if you go, I mean, and also the reference to psychoanalysis. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which essentially where Freud is dealing with war neuroses and shock, and the way in which there's a compulsion to repeat the experience over and over again. And the way, and it leads, there's a way in which Freud is grappling to try to lead a way out of that and go in a different direction. Could Benjamin be mapping, Freud's analysis of that onto art, and also basically bringing in Benjamin as well into that?
I mean, I can't disagree with that. I mean, it's a very interesting proposition that, that the confrontation with being privileged over eros at a certain moment in history, beyond the pleasure principle, there could be a different direction, no question about it in my mind. And this kind of repetition, the compulsion to repeat, as you said, repetition, compulsion, which is a crucial aspect of traditional psychoanalysis, right? Yeah. Not with our friends Deleuze and Guattari.
Patrick,
Right?
I just wanted to ask Patrick to clarify that. Are you saying that the link there is that shock or trauma in Freud, traumatic experience, or resolve that trauma in some sense? It's ineffectual, I guess, in Freud. But and then how are you saying? I didn't quite get the link to.
This is an idea I floated out there.
Yeah, no.
And I can obviously see the influence of Brecht here, in terms of essentially, taking his notion of estrangement effect into film. But why does he bring in Freud? It just is. There's that element in terms of why, and so it requires further study. I'll just put it.
Brings in Freud. The Freud of the psychopathology of everyday life, because you see.
But I think there's more to it than just that.
Versus the surface. Right. He goes in section 13, the characteristics of the film lie not only in the manner in which man presents himself to mechanical equipment, but also in the manner by means of this apparatus can represent his environment. A glance at occupational psychology illustrates the testing capacity of the equipment. Psychoanalysis illustrates it in a different perspective. The film has enriched our field of perception, and I would agree with this, definitely, with methods which can be illustrated by those of Freudian theory, right? 50 years ago, a slip of the tongue passed more or less unnoticed, but only exceptionally may such a slip have revealed dimensions of depth in a conversation which had seemed to be taking its course on the surface. Since the psychopathology of everyday life, things have changed. This book isolated and made analyzable things which had hitherto floated along unnoticed in the broad stream of perception. For the entire spectrum of optical and now also acoustical perception, the film has brought about a similar deepening of our perception. And you can hear his Kantian coming here too, because he's really coming out of the Kantian school of apperception here. How do we apperceive something? It is only an obverse of this fact that behavior items shown in a movie can be analyzed much more precisely and from more points of view than those presented on paintings or on the stage. So he's separating out, even though psychoanalytic moment was really theatrical representation, he's making a case that film is really the psychoanalytic moment of the time. You know, the home movies, the traumas being reproduced, the compulsion to repeat, etc. As compared with painting, film behavior lends itself more readily to analysis because of its incomparably more precise statements of the situation. In comparison with the stage scene, the film behavior item lends itself more readily to analysis because it can be isolated more easily. You can freeze a frame, etc. Right? The circumstance derives its chief importance from its tendency to promote the mutual penetration of art and science. The screen behavior item, which is neatly brought out in a certain situation, like a muscle of a body, it is difficult to say which is more fascinating, its artistic value or its value for science. And you hear this in sports. Let's look at the film. Always, let's look at the film of the game. Let's look at what happens. To demonstrate the identity of the artistic and scientific use of photography, which henceforth usually were separated, will be one of the revolutionary functions of the film. So he's really trying to look at this as a new form, right? What is its revolutionary function? How does it serve, ultimately, in terms of, this new development, right? Yeah, go ahead, Carl. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, I was just going to say that, and I guess I'm still in my mind riffing off of what Patrick said. I mean, it was, yes, I agree with that interpretation. I also felt like that there's also a profound difference, I think, between psychoanalysis and the way he's talking about film in this section, in that he's really talking about a more detailed magnification of surface. And psychoanalysis is talking about decoding the surface to what's underneath. And I think you could say they're different logics, but that's
right.
We could debate that. But
well, at the end of the passage,
Patrick, I was just thinking like.
Yeah, let Patrick say. Yeah, go ahead. Patrick.
No, I just was going to say at the end of the passage, he does make reference to unconscious impulses.
Yes, he does.
Yeah.
It's very beautiful. Hence, the camera intervenes with the resources of its lowerings and its liftings, its interruption and its isolation, its extensions and accelerations, its enlargements and reductions. The camera introduces us to unconscious optics, as does psychoanalysis to unconscious drives or impulses.
Well, but also, I mean, there is, Carl is right. I mean, it is on the surface in the sense that the unconscious is on the surface. In terms of, there's a whole discussion about interpretation of dreams and in terms of how you go about doing it. And one of the arguments is that it's stuff that's, it's there. You just don't understand it in the way in which understanding it is unconscious. But anyway, that's a different.
Right. Well, but that's interesting.
Yes, but I mean,
that would support
Freud himself. Yeah, I mean, let me just go for a second. Freud himself said, "Against the poets, we must lay down our arms." Against the Pasolini film, who shows us what the fascist desire really is in a film like Salo, or we see it in other, in The Night Porter or things like that. Yes, you're right. The unconscious becomes on the surface because then it's projected out into just think of the language of psychoanalysis: projection, introjection, right? All of these terms, very filmic in some ways, or film takes it up as well, right? Now remember, 1895, the Lumiere brothers start, right? You're in the Méliès, right? You have the birth of cinema, 1895. Freud published his interpretation of the dream, 1900, right? By 1929, you're still in the silent film effort, that then the talkies come in during the Depression. Very clever to bring the talkies in at that time. What role does that play? He doesn't really speak about this, but there's a brilliant essay by Jean-Jacques Abraham about this, about why the talkies came on in during the Depression. talkies had very much of a connection. So I think psychoanalysis, he's very well aware of it. He's not, this again is not, the Frankfurt School and these intellectuals around Krakauer in the beginning, and of course the reading of Lukács, etc. They were well aware of Freud, but in the same way, they don't take up Freud, in psychoanalysis like the French did, right? In a sense, or they don't really, incorporate, other than looking at Freud in terms of, social implications, what psychoanalysis can help us understand socially, right? It was never the therapeutic aspect of this, right? It was never the talking cure, even though he's very well aware of this. And again, look, he's also talking about the difference between stage and film. Obviously, as Patrick was saying, but discussion between him and Brecht, about the stage actor, etc. And Pirandello, right-wing thinker, right? Ultimately, supporters of basically the fascist government in Italy. And he uses Pirandello too. 6 characters in search of an author. He uses him in terms of looking at theatrical space and the actor and what the actor is going through. So the strangeness is also being experienced there too, the actor, right, in the film. The disembodied, embodied. You have the whole person, the entire person, but at the same time is completely disembodied in actual space. So he's really looking at all these, I think, very highly layered, forms. Each time he makes a statement. That's why, it's very good to read this again. I just emphasize, I'm telling myself this too, to read slowly, because there's so much richness here that we could work with. Let me
one more thing, just kind of a quick blurb. If for anyone's interested in the relationship between Benjamin Brecht, and it does actually deal a little bit with the way this essay was created and the impetus behind it. I have not had a chance to read it, but I bought it recently. I don't know if anyone can see it up here. It's the story of a friendship by Erdmut Wizisla. So just
it's a very good book. There was also a story of the friendship between him and Scholem as well.
Oh, did he write that too?
This is Benjamin again. This is a very contradictory, very strange.
Yeah.
He's an amalgam. Again, this is not a one-dimensional thinker or two-dimensional. This is
right.
Has so many influences, so many levels to what's going on. One of the reasons I called him, the most important creative Marxist who's doing theory. I mean, I see so many backgrounds here, from Goethe's elective affinities, which he uses, to his reading of Proust, to the task of the translator, unpacking my library, of course, the Arcades project. He does what Marx may have done in terms of the poetry of the future. Look at the commodity and write the commodity in everyday life.
Well, that's for a future class. Maybe you'll teach one day a seminar on Benjamin's entire.
Okay. Yeah. But I mean, it's pretty amazing where he goes here. I mean, this is another thing too. I mean, again, to me, the task here is, again, this question of representation, right? How do you break through, if you will? And I know it's very ambitious in a way. It's like Proust. Proust wanted to stop time. He almost did, but, in remembrance of things past, this was his goal, right? Ultimately, he didn't write this in his notebooks, but this is essentially, if you read the 7 volumes of In Search of Lost Time, is probably a better translation. And especially if you read the past retrieved or refound, you begin to see that that's part of the project. In Benjamin's case, this project is really to write, again, this poetry of the future. I mean, Beryl's no longer here, but also through the analysis of toys that children are using, which we're very much distantiated from and don't really talk about so much, or how that mind is being framed. But anyway, I want to go back to this question of the mask. What's that, Carl? Yeah.
Oh, just before we leave this, this passage that we've been talking about it. I mean, again, maybe this is obvious and already been said, but I think that, he's talking about this potentially radicalizing and, progressive aspect of the film medium. And there's sort of throughout, he's talking about the actual technologies and its inherent potentials to transform how we see the world and to maybe create a different kind of art. But it seems that if so many of these things, you just think about them today and they've sort of been incorporated into so much either past practice or current discourse, right? I mean, some of this stuff, about the internet, and it now allows everyone to produce and disseminate images. It's totally democratized, production, all these types of things. But it seems that what hasn't happened that he also talks about is, a mass proletarian movement. I mean, I don't think that seems fundamental is to what he's doing is without that, all of this other stuff is really kind of incidental. I mean, and maybe that's stating the obvious, but it seems it's important to keep in mind in terms of how to understand what he's saying. Right?
Well, I think this later section 15 begins to address this problem of the mass, right? And the masses, right? And he begins to you begin to get a sense of the more programmatic nature and some of the stakes that are involved. And I mean, part of the problem, you have Michael Denning, who wrote a very good book on the cultural front here. He's one of the best in the United States and stuff like that. But in general, the working class, if you will, or proletarian culture, except for the proletariats in Russia, and some of these moments, we have very, very little bit of that in some ways, right? You have union struggles and all of that, and some films. But in terms of the arts, you have to think about this, how does this really work, right? And even though you have in rock and roll, someone like the Allman Brothers from Russia's Dolls, who basically are very good friends with the blacks in the area, crackers and blacks come together, the blues and the great white guitarists of bands and part of things. But this is very few and far between, in some ways. So we have to really think about this carefully in my mind.
But what would you then say about something like rap or graffiti? Because rap and hip hop has in some ways become the dominant popular form.
Totally commodified.
Hmm?
Totally commodified today.
But again, it's not all of it.
Beginning it was fine, but totally commodified. Yeah.
But so is the teaching of so is this book. I mean,
Yeah,
so is this Zoom platform. I mean, it's all commodified. I mean, everything is commodified.
For monetary means, it has made it has created a massive industry. Yeah, sure, of course. Yeah, no, I know everything is up for grabs in terms of commodification. But what does hip hop say today that's particularly subversive?
Well, I think you need to not treat hip hop as one phenomenon. I mean, there are different movements within hip hop, and I think the same thing about like street art. I'm just saying that there is proletarian culture, there is working class culture, and I think that it's very quickly appropriated, but people continue to produce it. I mean, just in San Francisco in the pandemic, there's been this explosion.
Hip hop emerged because there was no proletariat. There were no jobs.
But there's been an explosion
against employment, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but in San Francisco, there's maybe in New York also, there's been like all this graffiti art. Some of it's just beautiful. I love it. And it's just exploded on all these buildings that have been.
But again, that raises the question: is art a statement?
Well,
right?
but that's non-commodified activity. These are obviously things that take people time to produce, and they're not. They're just sitting on a building. You can go throw paint on them if you want. Right.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, Patrick, go ahead. Yeah, and then I want to read this section on them.
Okay. Yeah. No. I think that there's a model here in the sense that there are fantasies that basically get expressed initially in movements. Rap is one of them. I mean, you can talk about specific developments in rap, and what happens is they get organized and integrated into the logic of capital, to put it in a crass way. There's a good book by Knecht and Klug, two German writers. It's been translated on the public sphere, written against Habermas, but also they talk about the materiality of the public sphere.
By
And
the
they,
way, Alexander Kluge is a filmmaker as well.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. One of his
And they talk about that, this process of the fantasies essentially get organized and integrated within capital. And you can still, and using Freud, you can probably, through a kind of analysis, you can uncover those liberatory elements within them, but they are ambivalent, you know, and that's the character of culture in terms of.
That's a good point. And I mean, Kluge, by the way, has made a massive program of completing Eisenstein's Capital. Eisenstein, before he died, was in Mexico wanting to film Capital. Kluge took this up. I think it's only available on European DVDs. So you need the adapter or whatever you guys need. But anyway, I've had the privilege of seeing it. It's worth seeing. Yeah. Definitely. I saw the first part at Columbia. It was screened there about 10 years ago. But he's worth knowing. And in my opinion, he is sort of a kind of synthetic moment between Brecht and the Frankfurt School, Kluge, in many ways. And actually a practicing artist. Also had a German TV series on culture, you know, that was in. And he comes to the Goethe House. Yeah, he's, very, 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 very interesting thinker. And Oscar Neck was a leading sociologist in you know, and they wrote that great book on the proletarian public sphere. And Patrick's absolutely correct. The structural transformation of the public sphere, they were arguing against the early Habermas. Yeah, very much. Before communicative action, etc. Yeah, and yeah. This was the struggle somewhat over the inheritance of the Frankfurt School. In a lot of ways in Germany, post you know, late 50s and early 60s, they became of age. But let me go to this notion of the mass, because I think this is a very crucial section, section 15. The mass is a matrix from which all traditional behavior towards works of art issues today in a new form, right? Quantity has been transmuted into quality. The greatly increased mass of participants has produced a change in the mode of participation. The fact that the new mode of participation first appeared in a disreputable form must not confuse the spectator. Yet some people have launched spirited attacks against precisely their superficial aspect. Among these, Duhamel has expressed himself in the most radical manner. What he objects to most is the kind of participation which the movie elicits from the masses. Duhamel calls the movie a pastime for helots, a diversion for the uneducated, the wretched, the worn out creatures who are consumed by their worries, a spectacle which requires no concentration and presupposes no intelligence, which kindles no light in heart and awakens no hope other than the ridiculous one of someday becoming a star in Los Angeles, right? So this is interesting, right? In a way, yeah. The clear view of the disrespect and, you know, dissing of the masses in general. Clearly, this is at bottom the same ancient lament that the masses seek distraction, whereas art demands concentration from the spectator. This is a commonplace, or that is a commonplace. The question remains whether it provides a platform for the analysis of the film. Very, very important here. A closer look is needed here. Distraction and concentration form polar opposites, which may be stated as follows. A man who concentrates before a work of art is absorbed by it. He enters into this work of art the way legend tells of the Chinese painter when he viewed his finished painting. And in contrast, the distracted mass absorbs the work of art. Okay, so this is interesting. Absorption, being absorbed into the work of art, right? Versus that of, you know, the viewing of concentration, concentration that is going on earlier before the work of art is absorbed by it. Distraction, right? And concentration. This is the most obvious with regard to buildings. Architecture has always represented the prototype of a work of art, the reception of which is consummated by a collectivity in a state of distraction. The laws of its reception are most instructive. And by the way, I just make a little short footnote. If any of you are in Brooklyn and you go by DeKalb and Flatbush, you look at the new atrocity that is being built above Juniors, using Juniors and the old dome savings banks, the dome of the dime savings bank, you begin to see the black and the gold, the Gilded Age building right there in downtown Brooklyn on the corner of DeKalb and Flatbush. It's so obvious, this architecture that's playing out today in terms of the statement being made by the rule of New York by this billionaire class, right? In so many ways, the Michael Bloomberg faction, if you will, who allow these kind of zoning laws to let this happen. Okay, building have been man's companions since primeval times. Art forms have developed and perished. Tragedy begins with the Greeks, is extinguished with them, and after century, its rules are only a revived. The epic poem, which had its origin in the youth of nations, expires in Europe at the end of the Renaissance. Panel painting is a creation of the Middle Ages, and nothing guarantees its uninterrupted existence. But the human need for shelter is lasting. Architecture has never been idle. Its history is more ancient than that of any other art, and its claim to being a living force has significance in every attempt to comprehend the relationship of the masses to art. Buildings are appropriated in a twofold manner, by use and by perception, or rather by touch and by sight. Such appropriation cannot be understood in terms of the attentive concentration of a tourist before a famous building. On the tactile side, there's no counterpart to contemplation on the optical side. Tactile appropriation is accomplished not so much by attention as by habit. As regards architecture, habit determines to a large extent even optical reception. The latter two occurs much less through rapt attention than by noticing the object in incidental fashion. This mode of appropriation, developed with reference to architecture in certain circumstances, acquires canonical value. For the task which faces the human apparatus of perception at the turning points of history cannot be solved by optical means, that is, by contemplation alone. They are mastered gradually by habit under the guidance of tactile appropriation. I think this is important to remember what he's saying. This is the programmatic in many ways. The distracted person, too, can form habits. More, the ability to master certain tasks in a state of distraction proves that their solution has become a matter of habit. Distraction by art presents a covert control of the extent to which new tasks have become soluble by apperception. Since, moreover, individuals are tempted to avoid such tasks, art will tackle the most difficult and the most important ones where it is able to mobilize the masses. Today, it does so, and again, his emphasis in the film, reception in a state of distraction, which is increasingly noticeably in all fields of art and is symptomatic of profound changes in apperception, finds in film its true means of exercise. The film, with its shock effect, meets this mode of reception halfway. The film makes the cult value recede into the background, not only by putting the public in the position of the critic, but also by the fact that at the movies, this position requires no attention. The public is an examiner, but an absent-minded one. I think this is very, very important. And then he goes in the epilogue where he talks about the growing proletarianization of modern man and the increasing formation of masses are two aspects of the same process, and how fascism attempts to organize this very much so. I mean, look, you can do a history of cinema and show how there have been complete shifts, in my view, that you've seen complete shifts in the political space in which people occupy. You can begin to see this in the movies of the 80s around There Is No Alternative. You know, the choice of Hollywood, what they're doing, you know, in many ways. This is very, very important to look at, right? Why is West Side Story being remade by Spielberg, right? He has nothing better to do, this guy, this is another story that needed to be remade, right? Yeah, in a sense, this is another, does this really have any necessity out there? Of course, it's going to basically take the multicultural, it's going to basically deculturate what was very present in the film with much more energy. I already did an analysis of some of the sequences because I'm interested in stuff like this. I went back and watched West Side Story with George Chakiris and Natalie Wood back in the day, right? It's so much better. I mean, why would it have to be remade? It's 10 times better than this idiocy that's hundreds of millions of dollars today. So you have to ask your question, the question, has capitalism, what is Benjamin proposing here? That in some ways, the capitalism has run out of ideas and that all it can do in some ways, this is one thesis about what this is about. The capitalism reaches this point where it can only recycle, right? The cult value of the past, right? And the exhibition value of the past, and never get to the level of breaking through to something new towards this poetry of the future. Is this what we're always about? Does fascism do the same thing in terms of its aesthetic mode of approach, right? And as Goebbels once said, those who control the streets control the state. This is very important to remember.
I found this particularly this last paragraph very confusing. I mean,
Yeah.
I wonder what other people. I'd be very interested in hearing what other people. It seems very ambivalent, but ambivalent in almost a confused sense. Like I don't know. It just seems like a very strange ending to the essay to me. I mean, I can't really tell what he's saying. He's saying film is distraction, that architecture shows that distracted people can form habits. I mean, yeah, I understand that, but then it just seems it seems very unclear at this point. All these other prior things he said about film, I'm not sure where they kind of reside, like, the difference between the magician and the surgeon, or bringing in psychoanalysis. I mean, these very interesting ways he's talked about film disrupting perception and reality, and maybe constituting the basis of a new kind of artistic practice, or yeah, I just didn't understand how this fits in with anything. I don't know. It's lost on me somehow.
Well, I mean, I can hear from other people, but I mean, I can certainly reply. I mean, if you want. You want to say something, Douglas, or yeah?
Maybe you start. I'm still processing.
Okay. I mean, I think on one level he's talking about, look, film is this revolutionary form, right, that we have to work with at this point, right? He's not saying that it's really always going to lead to heightened consciousness. He's really trying to frame it in what it does in terms of a distraction, a distracted, consciousness in a way, but it also puts the viewer, or the person that goes to the movies, it basically displaces cult value of something, right? And the traditional value of something, and that the viewer then becomes the public as critic, right? Becomes participatory in a completely different position. It's a completely different subject position in this art form. It's not like going to the museum and watching a painting. He's again trying to talk about this revolutionary potential of film. However ambiguous it is, it still retains for him this revolutionary potential. And this habit of distraction, going to film is distraction. It's not, in a sense, I mean, it's a method of distraction. The question is, does it really alter, how much of the apperception does it really alter? That's what it is. It is a struggle for the control, if you will, of a new, going that tendency that it really has. And it's not distantiation in the Brechtian sense either. You know, he has that in mind in some ways, and we see this in filmmakers. Kluge's expert at it, if you've seen any of Kluge's films, particularly Ferdinand the Strong, which is a movie that I don't think you can. I mean, I've been looking all over for it. But anyway, your films like The Chaplain, you know, the Abel Ganses, all of these kind of films are for him, you know, part and part of where the public finally can be part of the
yeah,
moment,
no,
right?
I agree with that. I mean, I think just to put a point on it, I mean, I think there are a couple things I would say. Is that I think this is really the beginning of cultural studies. I mean, this is the makes this a lot of things that have happened since make this essay seem less revolutionary in itself, because we're so used to these types of what's the word, conventions or these constellations. But this is quite powerful in the sense that he's critiquing the bourgeoisie. So the aura is exploded because it's his focus is on trying to destroy the relationship with art that the masses and bring in the masses. Now, my only problem with the essay is that once the masses are in the picture, it's not quite clear who is guiding the masses and what kind of agency, if any, the masses have. But that's a problematic, I think, intrinsic to any Marxist critique, I would say.
Especially to Walter Benjamin.
Yeah, yeah.
He did not have a political program in an intellectual - cultural program in mind.
Right.
But he did not.
He's not the Gotha program.
In many ways, right? You know, I don't know, Carl.
Can I ask a question, like a very specific? How do you interpret the sentence? Distraction, as provided by art, presents a convert control of the extent to which new tasks have become soluble by apperception.
Well, yeah, I mean, people have, I mean, this kind of sublimity, catching perception by surprise. There are all kinds of moments here where you may say, you know, that something in the society hits you a certain way, and your apperception has been conditioned in a different way by the film, or it's been transformed in some ways. And art has that ability. Look, again, I mean, you know, there's probably nothing really that new under the sun in terms of artwork. You can probably locate every stroke of the graffiti artist or the statement artist, you know, et cetera, et cetera. You can go back to Joseph Du Bois and say, okay, this is where Bansky took his inspiration. This is what's going on. How is all this being reproduced? At the same time, he's talking about how this distraction, we don't go to cinema, you know, going to be changed. However, there are certain things that slyly get in, slyly, you know, make a difference, right? In a sense. So I think he's talking about that, you know, that it's a covert control. It's not something that we see immediately. You got to go see that film. It's going to change your life. You know, it happens or it doesn't, you know, in a certain way. You know?
Well, he's talking about new tasks. I mean, I could just even go more granular into this, that, you know, he's talking about this idea of tasks and learning tasks, and you know, he's saying you could probably, you know, distraction, you can be distracted and still be learning new habits. Right? That's so, yes. So he's using architecture, like we don't, you know, sit in contemplation in our house, you know, or in our kitchen. We learn it through tactile interaction. So I get that, but I guess I'm just not. What was not clear to me is how this then, like, what is this new task that's now become soluble by apperception? I mean, it was some of these phrases I wasn't able to precisely locate in terms of.
But for him, it's the shock effect. This, you know, this is where he's really trying to go. The shocking effect of how can it really shock you into something.
I think it's also, I mean, apperception, you referred to it earlier, Michael, about
Yeah.
Kant.
Yeah.
But I mean, take it back into Heidegger and his interpretation of Kant. And it's much broader than simply space and time. Well, it's time, obviously. But when he talks about this art form, it's visual. It's not a text. It's tactical. You know, it's about the body, and it's a big change in culture that's taking place here. It didn't exist before. You know, you could talk about painting or something like that, but then photography and then film come in, and it remakes the way in which apperception essentially constitutes reality, the kind of relationship. And part of that whole process is the distancing, the destruction of cult, the destruction of aura. You know, there's a new sensibility that's coming into existence. And this is only one facet of a process that's taking place. And just as I referred to earlier to Knecht and Klug in the organization of fantasies, this has essentially been co-opted in some ways, but there still is an element, a liberatory element there that's a possibility.
Absolutely. Fantasy in Greek, by the way, means to create.
Yeah. And this goes back to Heidegger, because his point about Heidegger is Heidegger's interpretation of Kant is a central component of the imagination.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But what is the task? He's I mean, this whole passage has been about, and this final paragraph in particular is that certain tasks. He's talking very specifically about.
Why don't you read it this way? Why don't you read it in terms of how he goes into the epilogue and the whole notion of the political space, that the public now is an examiner because film has opened up that possibility, right? In terms of new perception or the new primacy of perception, you know, in a way, and it's an examiner, but it's also absent-minded. So the task is to say, who are we going to get here? Because the next part of this is the epilogue, where the growing proletariatization of modern man and the increasing formation of masses are two aspects of the same process. Fascism attempts to organize the newly created proletarian masses without affecting the property structure which the masses strive to eliminate. Fascism sees its salvation in giving these masses not their right, but instead a chance to express themselves. And this is very important. I mean, this is good.
Just
The right to change property relation, fascism needs to give them an expression while preserving property, right? The logical result of fascism is the introduction of aesthetics into politics. The violation of the masses, whom fascism with its Führer cult forces to their knees, has its counterpart in the violation of an apparatus which is pressed into the production of ritual values. There are real stakes here, you know, in so many ways. You know?
So you think like what he's, yeah, that so the new task, it seems almost is the attempt to kind of mobilize the these ways to transform consciousness in some sense, and he's saying that there's a very different way that transformation.
I mean, it's no accident that Fred Jameson, who's a very literary-minded, philosophical-minded critic of Marxist variety, writes a book called The Political Unconscious.
Right.
Yeah,
But
you know,
do you think that that's when he's specifically referring to tasks? I mean, that this final epilogue is kind of the contrast between the aestheticization of politics by fascism and futurism, and then he counterposes that to the politicalization of art. Right?
He goes through, I mean, going back to what Doug mentioned about Abel Gance last week, and this passage on Gance, the glorification of war, you know, through Marinetti. Phil, yeah, Phil. Yeah, I see your hand up, Phil. No, okay. Oh, okay. You're waving to someone? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, he goes through this. He talks about Marinetti, et cetera, and then the clarity of how fascism works in a certain way. You know, the clarity of the Futuristic Manifesto. This is a real struggle. I mean, if you read this as he's really struggling with these movements of his own time that are still with us today, You know, you can go back and read the Futurist Manifesto. It's very, very active with us. You know, you read people like Wyndham Lewis, you know, Fables of Aggression, you know, and Wyndham Lewis, what was the name of that journal? I have a copy of it, Blast, right? The ballistics he talks about earlier in Dadaism. You know, these were movements, these were control. Dadaism, surrealism, all movements out there in a certain way. But at the same time, the fascist is promising, you know, in the sense of the preserving the property. You have expression being given to these people. The absent-minded, if you go back to this, think about the subject that he's dealing with. You know, in the previous, his commentary forms, in a way, he doesn't, he ends, if you will, after mentioning Marinetti's quote, he ends by saying communism responds by politicizing art.
Right. So it seems,
Not by
like in
aesthetic, but by politicizing art, right?
Right.
Interesting. Right? Yeah.
So it seems like in some way the task he's talking about, you could almost, it seems that what he might be getting at is basically the installation of new habits into the masses. You know, how do you install or teach or bring about new forms of consciousness,
It's always about education. I mean,
right,
you know.
new habits and practices, and that he's sort of seeing in the film, you know, almost a form of propaganda in some interpreting it.
Yeah, no, I mean, yes and no. Yeah, it depends on what we mean here about propaganda, because he's going on the manifesto, you know, if the natural utilization of productive forces is impeded by the property system, the increase in technical devices and speeds and the sources of energy will press for an unnatural utilization. And this is found in war. This sums up exactly what we're going through. Yeah, this is basically what, you know, many of these, people, when you start reading really the post-Clausewitzian, post-Foucaultian universe that we're living in many ways, is this, what's speeded up here? What constantly is happening in this, if you want to call it late capital, I rather call it late liberalism politically and hyper industrialization. At this point, the epoch, instead of neoliberalism. But anyway, liberalism refers to the politics, but the economics is obviously hyper-industrialization at this point, with the corresponding, financialization of everyday life. In fact, a kind of forced financialization in many ways. So yeah, so he has a this is very sophisticated. If you think about this, if you go back and look at Leni Riefenstahl's, he doesn't mention Riefenstahl here, but The Triumph of the Will and The Olympiad are both very powerful films. I mean, if you really think about this and what's being altered in perception and how people can be taken in by that, in many ways. Yeah.
I wonder.
Yeah, please, Patrick. Yeah.
I think that's part of, he talks about, he also uses the word habit.
Yes.
And it's almost like he's saying that film essentially is remaking our way of looking at the world, and it becomes habitual, and that opens up possibilities.
Yes.
And but talking about Riefenstahl, her influence was fairly extensive. Film after Riefenstahl is totally different in terms of.
Agreed. And she learned from Abel Glantz. If you go back and look into, I went back and looked. I didn't look at the whole film, but I looked at some segments of it. Yeah, very much. Abel Glantz is in this, and Glantz was he was not a fascist, right? He was not part of that moment. Yeah. So and maybe Riefenstahl wasn't either. She's just doing her job. She lived to be 103, by the way. Younger lived to be 103. Yeah, she was swimming, and she was still 100. So yeah. But anyway, yeah. So, I mean, I think this is very important, again, that there's tremendous levels there are so many layers in this that, again, I emphasize that Benjamin sees speed, he sees even the locomotive of history in the Leninist sense as being, we need the emergency brake, in a sense, that kind of stoppage. And in some ways, that is produced by, say, the negative dialectic that you may see in a film such as, well, you can think of it in two ways in cinema. You can think of the negative dialectic in what the extreme is in, say, a Lang film that I mentioned, like Dr. Mabuse and The Gambler, right? That whole sequence. And of course, M as being, part of this moment in Weimar. On the one hand, and then you can see the camera as the fourth term in the dialectic, because he's really very influenced by Vertov here. The three songs of Lenin, and he doesn't mention man in the movie camera, but you should watch man with a movie camera. It's very interesting the way the camera starts moving, in such a way that you're thinking camera position, no longer subject position always. And this is another struggle that he sees happening, to my mind. Yeah.
What year did he write this?
1935.
So had he become disillusioned with the Soviet Union?
Oh, he was disillusioned in 26 with that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I just, this paragraph is a very interesting paragraph, and I read it very much in the context he's writing in, and when still a sense of the possibility of mass political action, proletarian political action, and that's based on our discussion. I mean, that's how I.
Well, if you look at footnote number 19, if you have the edition that I'm using, I'm sure it's footnote number 10. The film is the art form that is in keeping with the increased threat to his life, which modern man has to face.
Mm-hmm.
Man's need to expose himself to shock effects is his adjustment to the dangers threatening him. The film corresponds to profound changes and the apperceptive apparatus changes that are experienced on an individual scale by the man in the street in big city traffic, on a historical scale by every present day citizen, right? So he has a very interesting notion of what the film does and what is happening, the changes in our terms, the history of our perception, right? The history of our perception. And he has these wonderful distinctions. I mean, you can really see this essay unfold on natural perception and historical. He's very, very good at this. Depth and surface, is also happening very, very importantly.
But I think he is talking about a struggle over consciousness, and I think that where, in some sense, this may be
more materialist than be a thinker of consciousness, in my mind.
Well, in this section, I think he's talking, he is talking to some degree about propaganda. And he is talking about, that the masses or that individuals do not want to undertake certain tasks, right? But that art will be able to, in some sense, do it for them. And that he's discovered in film this potential possibility of this, of a kind of the installation of new habits, the installation of new forms of thought, and that it is a struggle over consciousness. I mean, like when he's saying we need to politicize this medium, he's not saying, oh, it's just interesting, that as a field of, critical reflection, but that it needs to be seized by the communist movement actively, right, and mobilized. I think that's what he's actually saying here.
Yes, of course, yeah. No question about that. By politicizing art, what that means is another story. What does it mean to politicize art? In some ways, yeah. I mean, if you look at the communist art, the Nouveau Cinema, Phil knows something about this. In Latin and South America, you have the new cinema. Spinoza's great manifesto for an imperfect cinema. And you get Gutierrez Alea out of this. You get Glauber Rocha in Brazil. You get, of course, Patricio Guzman in Chile, Solanas, right? Many of these people all participate in this movement by politicizing art, but they're expert at technical reproduction. They really know the use, right, of camera, technique. They study perception. They understand this. But not only as propagandists, but as liberatory moments of the liberation, that film becomes a subversive form, right? In many ways that they're looking at. Phil, you want to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Guzman, I think, his whole thing was to let the story unfold, and not necessarily try to direct it, I mean, he did his battle is really his masterpiece. And it's really, it was a revolutionary moment, he felt. And he just put a bunch of amateur people out with cameras and had them go get up in people's faces, shove microphones in people's faces, get them to talk, capture the moment, the moments to the point where he captures one of his filmmakers recording his own death as he shoots the camera at the soldier who's taking aim at him and kills him.
Right. Camera's weapon meets real weapon. Yes. Right.
Yeah.
Yep. So yeah, no, of course. But I'm just trying to make a point that these people are, and you're right, Patricio Guzman lets in the documentary phase, and also in his reflective phases. I've seen some of his later movies that are very beautiful, in his older age, where he recounts that period, that much more radical period of the Allende moment, and then of course the assassination that took place in October of '73. But anyway. He actually has very reflective times, and he talks about the Washington Consensus, etc. And film becomes like a historical document for him too, as a way of educating. It's educational value, it's educative value. So I think, look, I want to go back to this. I don't think Benjamin has just one role of film as propaganda, right? And a one-dimensional view of its how it would be used politically. He certainly wants it for movement purposes, but he's thinking through this on levels of everything of what forms does film, how does it play out? Newsreels, documentaries, right? Fascist use through Riefenstahl, subversive movements too, through, say, a Chaplin in modern times. That's a critique of everyday life and the deadening power of factory labor, etc. Modern times is a classic. And then a great figure in the movement. The comic value, Jacques Hulot, Mr. Hulot, Jacques Tati, Mr. Hulot takes a holiday. Whole things like that. So he doesn't mention all of these as illustrative, but he's really trying to get, again, to that this is our revolutionary art form, right? The photograph is one of them, but really the revolutionary form is cinema, right? Is the use of cinema. Whether that's true today anymore. I mean, Carl, you say you don't sit there for 2 hours or 3 hours watching a cinema. To me, the cult value, I used to love just go to the movies myself, by myself. I would go at 11 o'clock in the morning when Film Forum or Cinema Village was opened up, and go see a movie in the middle of the day. That had a value to me, very much. It was almost like, for lack of a better term, a sacred profane, relationship, right? In a sense, you go to the movies to do, to be alone, but at the same time to really be present with something, to get some kind of certification out of it. And I think that, basically in a way, cinema has this enormous capacity. You have to think about that. Of what art forms has the most effect in terms of changing someone's vision, right? In a way, you know, as an actual form, right? Is it the optical, is the use of the optical, you know, film incorporates everything, right? The auditory, the optical, right, etc. You know, sometimes you can even feel, you know,
Yeah.
what's happening
Well,
there.
yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think well, that's a whole nother thing. I think for me, that just made me think like I still have the things that have affected me most profoundly, including art, has been written. Like I've
Right.
like in like a really profound way, like reading late Philip K. Dick. You know, I wasn't the same after I put that stuff down for about a month. You know, I was just like,
Yeah,
wow,
but if you
you know.
see a film like Blade Runner, it may even enhance the reading of even androids. You know?
Yeah, but not quite. It just
Okay. All right.
that's to me. But you know that's in some
Yeah,
sense. You know, yeah.
yeah.
But I just I was just going to say that again I think that, and I think a lot of us here are sensitive to this. That a lot of times when someone like Benjamin is read in today's academia, it just becomes fodder for sort of like you know academic papers that divorce themselves from the fact that he is writing in a political context as a political intervention. That what I'm saying about propaganda is really just that, and that there was still social forces that allowed one to think through aesthetics in the in this profound way as political practice. And if we ever have those movements again, I'm sure that we will be writing something like this again. I just don't think you can write something like this,
Well, there are artists out there. I mean, we're kind of, I mean, there are artists out there that are still doing, political art.
Oh yeah, no, and my girlfriend's an artist, and I see this
I
world
mean,
a
in a
lot.
sense, the question is how subversive and how much does it really enter the culture? And
Well,
the COVID has also taken us away from going to the movies, going to the art galleries on a regular basis. But this was part of a regular culture. And one thing I disagree with him on is the salon paintings, the neoclassical David and them. These were homegrown, revolutionary upsurges in painting, during that period, and the Rodin studios, in a way. So there are many levels here that he may be missing too, when he just wants to talk about photography and things, because David, the neoclassical style, you look at the Death of Socrates or the Tennis Court Oath and some of the Davids, they're very much anticipate photographic clarity. I mean, that's already there. And they were used to rouse, the Death of Socrates is done 2 years before the French Revolution. And David was very good friends with Maxime Robespierre. So, you have these earlier moments that he doesn't go to that you can really,
yeah. Michael,
yeah.
just to add to that, I mean, I think the energy of this piece, the furious energy of this piece, which Krakauer picks up on in his book, Film Theory of Film, is this idea that Benjamin understands the masses as the masses who are just beginning, because of modernity, to see themselves. Because during this time, there was most of human history, we did not have the mass. We had people at farms and things. So you have the people on the street recognizing themselves as part of this mass, but also as a collective. You have them in the theater sitting packed side by side, not experiencing art like in the museum as a kind of bourgeois experience on their own in their little insular bubble, but in a group. And that can lead to a kind of revolutionary kind of impact that they may take, that kind of consciousness, I think, of course, and you mentioned this before. I think of the movie Battleship Potemkin, which is one of the greatest crowd scenes in history with the baby carriage. And that scene, if you could see Benjamin seeing that movie and seeing how that could have this potential to go beyond what the cinema into something much larger than that.
No,
That film still makes me want to go organize a Bolshevik, group in my neighborhood.
everybody's still stuck in 1917. Yeah, we have very good takes out here right now. That movie,
I think that we need to introduce
right? Yeah, please, Patrick, yeah.
Yeah, we need to understand this in the sense of film. In the 30s, this essentially represented this radical moment in terms of, the change in habit. which he talks about. And that's part of the task, I think, is that change. And that's part of his notion of consciousness. It's beyond, language or something like that. It's a tactical component here.
Yes.
I think that in some ways, and I'm hoping this happens in the course with Kittler and Stiegler, is that we need to basically look forward to other forms of culture and the way in which they are organizing our experience, and how that may rebound upon the way in which film works. It's very much, I'm not stuck in 1917. I think that they're in May 68. Yes, I mean, I have a lot of partiality toward that, but I think that how this change will happen is really hasn't been figured out yet. And
No,
it's not.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and then today, of course, there's the internet, which is, it's interesting, to what degree does that further these types of developments and dynamics? To what degree does it potentially disrupt them? I remember reading this article, the person was saying that basically, is when all this was concerned about the internet, no one had attention span, no one could read a book or even an essay anymore, which is true for a lot of people, but the person was saying, well, so who cares? The whole idea of sort of sitting by yourself in solitary, space, immersed in another mind, is a bourgeois subject. It's very much a bourgeois notion.
It's atomization.
So it's kind of like if the internet is doing away with
revolutionary.
What?
No, I mean, it's atomization that's going on. It's not bourgeois. I mean, the bourgeois was a revolutionary class. I mean, they were the revolutionaries of the 18th and 19th century. I mean, part of the problem here is how does one understand how not to duplicate that, but we see how hard it is, how fast it becomes reappropriated, retaken in, etc. There's Jean-Paul Godard is domesticated. There's nothing but subversion in Godard if you go back over his whole history. And Jean-Pierre Melville, Claude Chabrol, all of these people of the new wave, and the predicates of the new wave, the Italian neo-realists, nothing but subversion, but they've become, museumified, almost part of a domestication process. This is what I mean by numbness, how these things become domesticated. And just to give you an example of the struggle, look what happens when Frankenstein goes to RKO. Instead of being true to the novel, in which the monster is intelligent, knows how to read, the monster is presented as this dumb proletarian, this oof, right? That is a fear of the masses. This is the way the Frankenstein movie comes across, completely distorted from the actual account that Mary Shelley has going on. Has nothing to do with what Mary Shelley intended, but it is put in the new monster is the proletariat. This is what RKO does to a whole group of masses during the Depression because of the fear of a proletarian revolution. Think about this, the way cinema is used at crucial times, many ways, right? Yeah. I mean, and how then this becomes marketed, etc. So you study the Hollywood studio system, and I think this is very important in the culture industry that, Adorno and Horkheimer are really on today. It's kind of, as Doug was saying, it's passé, and you too, Carl, that this is academic paper at work, right? And, in a sense, but just think about how much, they really understood this as an industry, this cultural reproduction, this cultural recycling, etc. Why Adorno was so mad, why he would write an essay about jazz the way he did. The jazz essay, Adorno had no interest in jazz. He was friends with, to put it to you, he was friends with Coleman Elkins. He knew Coleman, he knew the Hawk back in England. And he wrote 2 or 3 pieces against the racism that was going on in the London clubs. This was Adorno's interest in jazz. And he liked Coleman Hawkins very much. Who did he listen to? Glenn Miller, Mitch Miller. These are the people that he was listening to, in terms of jazz. He never touched Bird or Charlie Mingus or any of these. which he would have seen things. But you know what his essay was really about at another level is how things become perennial fashions, right? In a way, right? And he's probably right about Dixieland, how it formed in a way, and maybe the castrated, you know, quote, Negro at that period that needs a form of expression out there. He uses images like this, you know, yeah, in a sense. But yeah, he's looking at the perennial fashion of something, you know, that's coming down in that essay. At the same time, he misses the boat completely. Benjamin probably wouldn't have missed the boat if he had been in the same position to hear people here, because he was more interested in the city. He was more interested in the flaneur. He was more interested in, you know, the architecture and all this, you know, in a way. So yeah, very different. Yeah, in many ways. So I think this is important to keep in mind. You know, look, reading something like this, there are many, of course, many levels. The internal schisms in the Frankfurt School about what the aesthetics of the future should look like and what that political moment was. You know, Marcuse, for example, is writing The Aesthetic Dimension late, which was to me an outline, you know, of his you know, what the aesthetic dimension is to look like. It's really an outline. It's not really a book. It's published, you know, but anyway, so he goes there. Of course, Adorno writes aesthetic theory. Horkheimer never really went into this so much. Obviously, Krakauer was tremendously influenced with this, but he was never, you know, internal. He was kind of a master outside of the Frankfurt School. You know,
Yeah, they'd never let him in.
yes, that's true. That's true. And you know, so again, this is important to remember to situate this text. Also, this text is really, yes, an indication of maybe a coming program that is not going to allow itself to be recouped by the fascists, right? To be recouped and politicized, you know, the politicization of art in terms of the fascist hands, which has happened. I mean, they've controlled it in many ways for many years. I mean, that they keep winning. Yeah, they control not only consciousness, etc. They control, you know, yeah, all the culture industry apparatuses, right? Not only the frameworks, because apparatus is really the gestalt in a certain way, you know, how it's framed up, but they also, you know, are you know, constantly reappropriating and taking. Look, for example, the role of sports, right, as a distraction, and film and sports, what has happened, you know, during the last 40 years. You know, the minute you had, you know, the revolt of the black athlete at the Olympic Games, you begin to have consciousness around Muhammad Ali, Lou Alcindor, then Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, et cetera, many athletes. The minute this sort of started, what goes on in baseball? You start having free agency, big salaries, right? What goes on in terms of sports? How is ESPN formed, which is the most dominant network out there right now? You know, everybody wakes up in the morning. I mean, I hear people all over the place. They just chatter about the sports programs and the sports game. This has become the new filmic experience. And this is a control by fascism. Look what happens to such a mild thing like Colin Kaepernick, how much control they have. Think about this. This is a guy that takes a knee, you know, and this is blown so much out of proportion by the owners to make sure he never plays again in the NFL. Right?
Yeah, I mean, they kicked. He took them to the Super Bowl, and his coach, you know, his coach also, you know, took them to the Super Bowl, and the team got rid of both of them.
Exactly. So, I mean, think about this too, how this really works. You want a materialistic analysis, you know, you have to look at all these cultural forms and then the role of the cinema, right? The role of the cinema, the role of everyday mediatic representation, and how this is taking over in a way. So I think he gives us many crucial keys to this in a sense, because you begin to see the sports a cult value, right? The privileging of the new celebrity culture, the platform culture, to go onto the internet, that you can tweet out about Black Lives Matter, but heaven forbid that you take $10 million of your $100 million, 5-year salary and give it to form good schools in the ghetto. It's like Oprah Winfrey. How many times has Oprah Winfrey opened a school where it really counts? She goes to Africa. That's the safest bet in town, instead of building here where you made it and really working through transformation. Very few.
I mean, you mentioned sports. The whole thing. What are the habits that are basically formed?
Yes, exactly.
What's a tactic, level? How is the body shaped?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a gladiator. Football's a gladiator sport.
Yes, right. Yeah, absolutely. And you're in an area where there's nothing but sports. The New England Patriots,
Listen,
the Boston Bruins.
I have a small celebration when the Patriots lose. I don't have to deal with that shit.
I am a secret New York Mets fan. Okay.
Oh my.
It's out now.
The hedge fund.
I actually need to jump off a little early, but I just
No problem. This was good.
one of the things that I also picked this back up. I haven't looked at this for a very long time, and I found it a very interesting, rich juxtaposition to this essay. Because
why would it be a juxtaposition? I'm kind of interested in that.
I think that Society of the Spectacle is much, he's looking at what's actually happened to this image world, this massive production of images. And it was interesting to read his conception of spectacles is very Lukashian. It's very much, it's very much out of the kind of history and class consciousness.
Me, it seems more Bachian, right?
And spectacle is really a form of power,
and then
a form of separation. And I just thought it was, more the kind of the dark interpretation, right, of sort of what has actually occurred. And it just seemed very.
Well, it's 32 years later.
Yeah, but I haven't looked at it for years, and I was very impressed picking it up. What he was.
Gerard Lebovici, by the way, was, I think I told you this, the great bank robber who escaped twice from the maximum security prison here in Montreal, Laval, right? Was a very much of a hero here in the Quebec culture, and he was famous for getting on the airplane and Viva Quebec, just like Charles de Gaulle. But anyway, ended up in Paris. He was gunned down in '79, but he had 2 children. They were adopted by Gerard Lebovici. So there is a rumor out there, I don't know this for a fact, but there's a pretty active rumor that a lot of Mezrines, Jacques Mezrines, bank robbery winnings, or whatever you want to call it, assets, went to the left causes, right? And he was gunned down by the police, and then Lebovici was targeted after that. He was the godfather to this moment. So it's kind of interesting. Vis-a-vis De Boer, who was totally depressed. That was his best friend, Gerard Lebovici, right? Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, I'll see you next week. Yeah.
So next week, why don't we sum up Benjamin, and then we go on to the first chapter of Technics and Time of Volume 3 on the cinematic image, right? We'll go back to what Patrick knows well, transcendental apperception, right? We'll go to the camera position in a certain way and look at this in terms of time too. We haven't really worked with time as much with Benjamin as we should, but he has good value, the value of the cult time, value of the exhibition time, the value, he has many things here that are very interesting that way. Yeah. And I love this phrase of Marx, we are interested in the poetry of the future, right? Forget the nostalgia of the past. Right.
So what was the reading exactly?
Let me get the book. I'll give you the actual pages.
Good.
It's from Bernard Stiegler's book on. Let me just get it out. Yeah, it's volume 3. The book is entitled Cinematic Time.
Okay.
And the Question of Malaise. So if you could read the introduction, and also that's 7 pages. and then we can go over the chapter. We're going to probably have to take at least a week on cinematic time, and the second one then goes into consciousness.
Okay.
And by the way, there's a long, Patrick, the great thing about Bernard Stiegler, and for all of you, is that there's a long engagement with the Frankfurt School, especially the culture industry apparatus and the dialectic of enlightenment. And we're going to read a section on that too, the automation of the superego.
Oh.
Right, we're going to read that
Yep.
later, after we go through cinematic time. So that'll be the second reading from Stiegler, in a book that should have been titled Capitalism's Lost Its Mind, but it's called The Lost Spirit of Capitalism. Yeah.
Okay.
And unfortunately, we lost him. I mean, I just begun to write him and tell him of some of the work we're doing here in the States, but we lost him last year, unfortunately,
Yeah.
which is very sad, Yeah, so anyway, yeah. Okay. So good. We lost Kittler too. So so two of these giants in this kind of study is that. So yeah, Bernard Stiegler, Technics in Time. I'll introduce him too. But let's go back over the Benjamin a little bit. Sum it up. I don't really feel totally satisfied. We've covered it totally. It's a very something worth rereading. This work of art in the age of
Cool.
and
And also the